Karl Rove, in Courage and Consequence, you write about the fact that you had doubts about Vice President Cheney being selected and that you had to share those doubts in front of him. What was that like?
Well, it was an interesting moment because when Governor Bush, then Governor Bush, was sort of settling in on his vice presidential choice, he liked Cheney as opposed to the others that we were looking at, the other 9. He liked the guy who was in charge of the process. So he called me at home. He was coming in off of the road, and he said, "I want you to come over." He knew I was against Cheney. There were 5 or 6 of us who knew about this. He'd sworn us all to secrecy. He said, "I want you to come over tomorrow morning to the governor's mansion and lay out the case for Cheney." And just said, "Come and be prepared. Tell me why you don't think it ought to be Cheney." So I went over to the governor's mansion and sat down in a very small room, the Austin Library, with him, and sitting just about as close as I am to you. And for about 30 or 35 minutes, maybe a few paces further apart, I laid out the case against Cheney. And I had 8 reasons why, starting with we didn't need to worry about Wyoming, that Cheney had been a very conservative member of Congress from Wyoming, and we'd have to defend his voting record, including voting against a resolution calling for the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, that he'd had a heart attack starting at the age of, in his mid-30s, and we'd have to defend questions of his health and fitness, and so forth. And this went on for about 30 or 35 minutes, and as I laid out the case, occasionally Governor Bush would say, "Well, I agree with that, but what if I said this?" And, "I disagree with that, and what would you say if I said that?" And so it went on for about 30, 35 minutes, and at the end of it, when I've exhausted my list, he said, "You got anything else?" And I said, "No." And he turns to the guy sitting next to him and says, "Dick, do you have any questions for Karl?" When he invited me over, he didn't say, "I'm going to have Dick Cheney there and you need to lay out the case in front of him." But it goes to show first a couple of things about Bush. One is that he viewed this as a governing decision, not as a political decision, because he called me the next day and said, "You're right on most or all of that stuff, but that's all politics. You can deal with that. My job is to worry about if something happened to me, whom would the country have confidence in?" And second of all, it showed Bush's style, which is he likes to have people around him who have strong opinions and may or may not agree with his, and are willing to lay them out in a respectful, straightforward way in front of others who might have a different opinion. And it was quite an experience.
Did your opinion of Dick Cheney change over the 8 years?
Well, my opinion of him, when I left the room, I thought, oh, great, I've irritated the guy who's likely to be the next vice president. But as we walked out, Cheney said, "I agree with some of what you have to say." And we became great friends. He never held it against me. It says something about Cheney that he has, he said that was my job. My job was to, think through those questions, and he wasn't going to take it personally.
What's a Rovian campaign?
It's not what it's normally depicted. In the book, Chapter 4, I talk about the ugly things that people say are at the heart of supposedly the kind of campaigns I run, most of which are, sort of fear-based, smear-based, mudball politics. And I've got a couple of great quotes in there from some people who've commented on it. The one that's my personal favorite is the guy who says Rove and his minions never stop surprised in being able to come up with something to even shock a 60-year-old Greyhound bus station hooker, end quote. Those kind of views are based on a very, very negative view of the electorate. Those fundamentally say the electorate can be won over by that kind of politics. And I don't see the American voters, particularly in high-profile races like for the Senate or for governor or for president, are motivated by those kind of base instincts. In fact, I think they reject them. The people who cross those lines and run those kind of campaigns tend to lose. In fact, tend to lose a lot. But a Rovian campaign is one that is based around, first of all, a big, authentic idea. What is it that man or woman running for office wants to achieve? Because at the end of the day, that's what voters are going to principally judge them by, is what is their vision, and also do they have the capacity, their background, their experience, their persona, that gives people confidence that they'll be able to achieve that vision. And it's not easy to do. I mean, the best way to look at a political campaign, as I say in the book, is to consider it as like the emperor's new clothes, that childhood fable we were all taught. Look, at the end of the parade, they're going to see you as you are. And hopefully they'll see you on one of your better days, but they're going to see you as you are. And so candidates who lack central values or core beliefs and just run on the basis of something that's completely phony tend to lose.
Then why is there a feeling about you by a lot of folks that you're negative and divisive?
Yeah. Well, and I deal with some of these myths. For example, in South Carolina, John McCain's campaign held Bush responsible, and by, I was easier to attack than Bush. I was supposedly responsible for this email from a professor at Bob Jones University that alleged John McCain had fathered an out-of-wedlock black baby. And it was ugly. It was a vicious little smear. But, a couple of things. One is, I had nothing to do with it. Even Jonathan Karl, who was at that time working at CNN, finally got a hold of the professor, who basically said, I did this on my own, and so what? I mean, I have a right to do it. But it was a vicious, bigoted smear on John McCain. The kind of thing that, look, South Carolina voters are not attracted by that. I mean, it was the kind of thing that on the surface of it just didn't help anybody who didn't want John McCain made president. I mean, it's the kind of thing that people naturally reject. Then what happened is McCain stood up and said, George Bush is behind this. South Carolina Republicans liked McCain and Bush. They liked them both. Not 1 in 1,000 would believe that George Bush was capable of doing that. My personal view when it happened was I was afraid, because I thought McCain would seize upon it to talk about himself. The story behind he and his wife's adoption of a young baby from a Bangladesh orphanage run by Mother Teresa is an incredible story of compassion and love. Just the kind of thing that in a campaign would explain a lot about who John and Cindy McCain were and serve as an enormous plus for them. But instead of saying, hold on, let's wait a minute, here's what I want the people of South Carolina and America to know about me. Instead he said, Bush did this, and shame on Bush, and I have no evidence that Bush did it, but, shame on Bush. And as a result, it was the whole mindset. It wasn't just this one event. This kind of attitude made itself evident in other ways in South Carolina that I talk about in the book, and lost the primary for McCain, and hence lost the nomination in the presidential election.
You also relate an incident where you had a chance to meet with John McCain later on.
Yeah. In 2004, McCain offered through a longtime aide and a person that I knew that McCain would campaign for us. And he made an appearance with President Bush in Washington State, which was non-political, and then a campaign rally. And the president had said, look, on this first sort of swing, I don't want you along. You can work out your problems with McCain later. And laughed. He thought that was funny. And so the first trip that I spent with McCain was in Florida. We flew to Pensacola, Florida, then took a bus to Niceville and Seaside and ended the day in Panama City. And when we got on Air Force One at Andrews, the president had a CIA briefing, so he said, go back and talk to McCain, entertain McCain until I'm ready. Well, this is sort of awkward because, look, McCain's campaign, and even McCain's wife, his wife famously said that she said, was asked if she would ever had a chance, would she stab me in the back? And she said, no, I'll stab him in the front. I mean, there were high emotions about this. So I go back to the back cabin and we sit down and start to talk, and it's a little nervous conversation. But then we start talking about Pensacola, where McCain had his naval aviator flight training, and he started talking about his days there. And it involved, little sports cars and lots of alcohol and, exotically named women. And it was funny. I've never laughed so hard in my life. He was one wild young naval aviator. And so we then flew into Pensacola, where he had done his training. And we went to a stadium or a facility that held about 10,000 people that was packed to the gills with people. And when they announced McCain and the president out, it was a sea of noise. And it discombobulated McCain. It was so wild a scene. And this is where the two of them take off their jackets. Bush raises his arms. McCain and he join and raise their arms. The president realizes McCain, because of his war injuries, can't raise his arms above here. And so the president is waving, and McCain is so overcome, he tries to talk to the president, say something to him. And this is the famous photograph that the Democrats used in 2008 of McCain, where he looks like he has his head buried in Bush's shoulder. But we campaigned the rest of the day, and it was an extraordinary day. This is really Bush country, the panhandle of Florida. And, I mean, more sheets were sacrificed and turned into campaign signs that day than you've ever seen. And the children lined the roads, and mobs blocked Highway 30A at Seaside and literally physically stopping the bus. And all along the day, I'm sitting in the bus next to McCain, and McCain starts going, look at that, and hitting me in the arm. I mean, my arm is, by the end of the day, literally black and blue. And then we end the day with a fantastic rally. It's in the driving rain in Panama City, 25,000 people in a town of about 100,000. We pull up, it is driving rain. Tracy Byrd is the country western singer singing. He's the only guy who's dry. He's undercover on the stage. And just as the bus pulls up and McCain and Bush get out, the clouds part, the rain stops, the sun begins to set in the Gulf of Mexico, and these two men emerge onto the stage. It was really a fantastic moment.